Alright, so I don't know about you, but sometimes I like to do a thought experiment in my head, and I imagine what I would be like if I had been born in different times or different places. Like, what would be the same about me and what would be different? If I had been born and educated in ancient Rome, or born and not educated in a medieval village, what would still be me and what would be completely different about me? We like to think, or at least I like to think, that who we are, who I am, would in some sense still be the same, regardless of where or when I was born. Not everything, of course, but that there is an usness to us on some level that is deeper than just the circumstances of our birth, that some part of me would carry through. We like to think that the choices we have made that define us in this life would find some echo in another life, in a different set of circumstances. Because regardless of where or when I'm born, it's still me doing the choosing. That's what I like to think. And to some extent, we know that some of that's true. We know, for instance, that there are some aspects to who we are that are genetic, that are not factors of time and place. There are famous cases of identical twins, you may have heard of them, that are separated at birth and placed with different families. And they have shared the same DNA, but they have completely different upbringings. And then they find each other later in life and often discover that they have remarkable similarities. There's one particular famous case, that of the Jim twins, where twin boys were adopted as infants by two different families. And when they met later in life, they found that both had named their childhood pet Toy. Both married and divorced women named Linda, and then married women named Betty. One twin named his son James Allen, A-L-L-E-N, and the other named his son James Allen, A-L-A-N. Talk about your nature trumping nurture. There's also the famous twins raised in very different circumstances. One became a princess of Alderaan, one went on to be Darth Vader. Completely crazy. Okay, so these are extreme cases, of course. But it remains the case that a lot of the things that make us who we are, our mental capacities, our behaviors, our personality traits, are part of our genetic inheritance. One person may be passive, one person active. One ambitious and driven, one easygoing. One aggressive or even ruthless, another generous or deferential. Parents with infants will relate to the idea that their children's personalities sometimes appear well-formed at a surprisingly early age, right? You know who your child is almost right off the bat. There's some things about them that are just them. About some things it seems we're born that way. But then again, even identical twins who share the same DNA, raised in the same family, can turn out different as night and day. We know that happens too. So it's a very complicated picture. Genetics might fix certain traits, or they might determine broad potentials that our environment then locks or unlocks, develops or lays stagnant. So it's simplistic and naive to say that people are just a product of their genetics. And it's simplistic and naive to say that people are just a product of their environment. As parents, we like to credit the steady hand of our guidance for our children's successes, right? And then we kind of smuggle genetics in the back door whenever they go off the plan. He did not get that from my family. I don't know where that came from, not from my side of the family. So the reality is that there seems to be this complicated interplay between genetics, environment, and parenting that goes on in shaping who we are. And then there's this really large X factor of individual human squirreliness that we just kind of scratch our heads and go, well, that's free will. And there's a caricature of liberals, including religious liberals like Unitarian Universalists, I don't know if you know this, that says that we sort of deny that animal genetic component that you might call human nature. And we deny that unknown squirreliness that you might call free will. And instead we kind of fixate on environment and upbringing. Liberals supposedly say that people are just the product of their environment. And we do this, allegedly, because we don't want to hold people morally accountable for their choices. And we don't want to demand personal responsibility. So we excuse, allegedly, dysfunctional or even criminal behavior by saying, he's just a product of a bad environment. I don't know if you remember the scene from West Side Story where a group of gang members are kind of mockingly singing to a police officer all the lines that social workers have fed them over their childhood. And they say, dear kindly Sergeant Krupke, you gotta understand it's just our bringing up key that gets us on hands. So simple and naive, just a product of their environment and upbringing. But there's nothing simple or naive about the following sets of observations that I'm going to make. Some children are born in homes or neighborhoods where they will be exposed to a wide array of environmental toxins, including lead paint, which can cause permanent neurological disorders, bad air, which can aggravate childhood asthma, contaminated drinking water, even here in Indianapolis, which leads to a whole host of illnesses. Some children will be given nutrition that is inadequate for growing bodies and brains as infants. Some will experience intermittent periods of hunger, and some persistent periods of hunger. These can aggravate developmental delays, and they certainly impact school performance. Some children will be exposed to a wide variety of stressors as children, including violence in the home or the neighborhood, untreated parental mental abuse, drug abuse, frequent moves, homelessness. These stressors, when they don't directly harm a child, can pile up to a condition that's called toxic stress that can lead to health problems later in life, like depression or anxiety, or even impact the development of the immune system and lead to diseases. And of course, they lead to poor performance in school. Some children will receive reduced parental attention and mental stimulation in their infant and toddler years. Researchers have estimated that by the age of 3, the average child in a professional family has heard 30 million more words than the average child in a family on public assistance, which leads to better brain development, which in turn predicts better performance at school. That's from the Robert Wood Johnson Foundation. And finally, some children, when they get to school, will attend schools with fewer resources, serving populations that are relatively higher in need. In a study of Baltimore schools, lower-income children there attended schools that were 65% made up of other lower-income students. By contrast, the higher-income children attended schools that were only made up of 30% lower-income students, 65% high need versus 30%. So these children, regardless of their genetic inheritance and regardless of their X factor, are being set up to fail at certain things. Not to fail to be good people, not to fail to be loving or kind or funny or loyal or curious or ambitious or helpful or any of those things. But they're being set up to fail at a few specific things, primarily finishing school, accessing decent, stable employment, and advancing their lifelong economic well-being. Now, some children, because of their genetic inheritance, that free will X factor, luck, what have you, grit, determination, they will persevere through this gauntlet of challenges. And they will enter adulthood on a trajectory to a more secure, healthier life than the one they were born to. Some of them will. Some will even end up wealthy, maybe even fabulously wealthy. But most of them will not. Which is not too surprising, because when you set people up to fail economically, economic failure is the usual outcome. Okay, so failure is a loaded word. So I want to be clear that when I talk about failure, we're weighing failure against sort of a popular American definition of success that goes, success is when you end your life richer than you started it. And I'm not actually putting a value judgment on that goal itself either. Right? That could be coming from a place of wanting to keep up with the Joneses. Right? Like Janis Joplin's immortal, "Oh Lord, won't you buy me a Mercedes-Benz? My friends all drive Porsches, I must make amends." Right? We're wanting to get ahead like that. But for many people, probably most people, it's coming from a place like, I want my kids to have an easier life than I had. I want my grandkids to have opportunities that I never had. And our national myth is that anyone who tries hard enough in America can succeed at this goal of accumulating wealth. And we really believe in this myth. It's foundational. We call America the land of opportunity because anyone can make it in America. Now, that's the myth. Unfortunately, the numbers paint a different picture. Now, undeniably, America as a whole has gotten richer since the 1960s. Most of that wealth has gone to people who are already super wealthy, right? That's an old story. Kind of take it for granted. But everyone got at least some of it. But it distributed in different ways. Most of the increase went to people with college degrees. They did very well. People without college degrees did not do so well. In terms of social mobility, about 40% of Americans who are born in the bottom fifth of the economic ladder will stay in the bottom fifth throughout their lifetime. The bottom fifth is households earning $20,000 or less per year. So that's not a lot of money. And 40% of people born into that level of poverty will never know anything different in their life, as things currently are in America. Only 6% of Americans born in the bottom fifth will ever climb into the top fifth. The top fifth begins at an income of about $100,000 a year. Now, $100,000 a year is a lot of money, but it's not like buy yourself a monocle and build hotels on Park Place kind of money, right? It's not yacht money. It's like upper middle class, probably, we would say. So even modest rags to riches stories are exceedingly rare. By contrast, 40% of kids who are born into that top fifth will be adults in the top fifth. They'll stay there. Being poor at birth is also a strong predictor of future poverty status. 31% of white children and 69% of black children who are born poor will spend at least half of their childhoods living in poverty. Children who are persistently poor in their childhood are significantly at risk to be persistently poor in adulthood. You don't get out of it. They're less likely to finish high school and half as likely to be steadily employed as adults. And this data is all coming from the Brookings Institute and the Urban Institute. So there's a book called The Long Shadow that was just released that got me thinking about this topic. And it details a long-term sociological study from Johns Hopkins, where they started in 1982, and they looked at a random sample of about 800 mostly lower-income youth from Baltimore. And Baltimore was in the 60s, it was an industrial boom city. It collapsed more or less when industry went overseas. It left kind of a really stagnant middle class. All of the construction kind of jobs went away. So it's a city with a lot of challenges. And there's a lot of kids, especially in the urban area, that are in this kind of lower income status. So they got 800 of these kids together, and they started tracking them from the 7th grade on, and they tracked them over the next 20 years. And the results for these children were basically in line with the statistics that we were just talking about. Only 4% of these children from low-income families ended up with a college degree by the time they were 28, either bachelor's or associate. In contrast, 45% of the children from the middle class or more affluent families got degrees, 10 times as many. Nearly half of the low-income children ended up at that same low-income level where they started. They never moved out of that bracket. Researchers found that the factors determining the children's eventual success or failure lock in very early in life. This was kind of the interesting thing about the study, because people had looked at these kinds of questions starting later, but they hadn't gone all the way forward to first grade. And what they found is it locks in really early, this path. By first grade, the lower income kids are already behind at school. By the time they're starting, they're behind. School serves sort of initially as an equalizer to help them catch up. But what happens is over the summer, they fall back because the more affluent kids are doing enrichment programs, they have more educational opportunities at home, and the lower income children don't have that, so they can't keep up. By the 4th grade, 75% of the middle class and up children say of themselves, I'm going to go to college and I'm going to finish college. They have that expectation and their life path set out, and they have support for it from parents who are supporting them or who know how to move them through that process. only 25% of the lower income kids in 4th grade would say of themselves, I'm going to finish college. And indeed, most of those kids were mistaken. The actual number was 5%. And about 30% of them went on to drop out of high school, with about half of those kids eventually getting their GED. The 30% of them did not complete high school on time. Now, it's not that education is not valued. And that's something that, sometimes there's discussion of the sort of culture of poverty that says that education is not valued. For these children and these families, that's not true. The study's author, Carl Alexander, says, when we last spoke with them as they were approaching age 30, 85% of the permanent high school dropouts said they expect to get more education. At age 30, they're still working on their education. The spark, he says, does not extinguish easily, and just about every dropout with whom we spoke expressed regret over the decision. As would be expected, limited job and earnings top the list, but other voices also are heard, wanting to be a better role model for their children, feeling remorse at disappointing their parents, and not infrequently believing that college might have helped them keep out of trouble with the law. Maybe if I had finished school, I would not be in prison, said one of the children. When the study concludes, many of these children are still pursuing education at age 28 because they do believe that education is the key to success. They're pursuing GEDs, associate degrees, technical licenses. Even the children who end up incarcerated, most of them are still trying to finish high school. But the obstacles are severe, and the rewards, when they do succeed, are limited. Alexander continues, their failed attempts at higher education outnumber their successes, and the successes mostly are in certificate and licensure programs, which benefit them little. For many of them, overcoming academic challenge is not the only hurdle and may not be the most formidable one. First-generation low-income college students often are workers first and students second, and they have family responsibilities. They might work hard to cobble together finances for a semester or two, and then stop out for a time when the money runs out, or when family obligations intrude, a parent or sibling in need, a child sick. Many lower-income college goers invest years, often many years, in pursuit of a college degree with little to show for their sacrifices. Okay, for the study's overall conclusion, Alexander puts it this way. A family's resources and the doors they open cast a long shadow over children's life trajectories, he says. This view is at odds with the popular ethos that we are the makers of our own fortune. Or, as the economist Joseph Stiglitz put it, the life prospects of an American are more dependent on the income and education of his or her parents than in almost any other advanced country for which there is data. Or, as an anonymous wag on the internet put it, the moral of the story is choose your parents very wisely. So, in the face of these kinds of statistics, it's impossible to take seriously the argument that what is going on here is a failure of character, such that exhorting lower-income families to just make better choices is somehow an acceptable response. Lower-income families, by and large, understand that the way to economic success in America leads through higher education and stable work. They value those things and they seek them out. But they're playing in a rigged game. That so many fail is evidence that the cumulative obstacles to success are simply too high for the average low-income child to surmount. And by fail, I remind we're talking about economic failure, not life failure. But economic success in America is not supposed to be like playing the lottery, where the random fact of where you are born determines whether you win or lose. Whatever else people have control over in their life, no one has control over the circumstances of their birth. The game is not supposed to be over before you ever have a chance to play it. And the consequences of economic failure can be significant. These differences in life prospect have serious consequences for the people who actually live them out. I don't know if you've seen it, but there's an incredible set of maps, again put out by the Robert Wood Johnson Foundation, that show you life expectancy by zip code for different American cities. So you can see the impact of just being born in a different neighborhood a couple of miles apart within the same city. And the results are pretty stunning. In Kansas City or in Tulsa, there are neighborhoods where the life expectancy varies by much as 14 years. That's the impact on something as basic as that, statistically. In New Orleans, life expectancies can vary by 25 years, depending on the neighborhood you're born in. 25 years for neighborhoods just a few miles apart. Now, as Unitarian Universalists, our second principle calls us to promote justice, equity, and compassion in human relations. And the picture we've drawn today fails on all counts. The extent of poverty in America and the extent to which poverty determines the outcome of people's lives in America ought to shock our national conscience. But far too often, instead, those who struggle with all of the ill effects of economic need and societal neglect are vilified in our country rather than assisted. And part of that, I think, is because their presence is an affront to our national myth. This is the land of opportunity. Anyone who makes good choices can make it in America. Therefore, if you didn't make it, you must have made bad choices, certainly choices that I would not have made. You have sinned. And in America, the wages of sin is socioeconomic hell. In this way, those who have can protect the comforting belief that if they were in the shoes of those who do not have, they would have done better. It's less scary to believe that than to accept the role of luck or good or bad fortune in our lives. The extent to which some of us are winners of a lottery and some losers. But in the end, we're all playing this American game that could turn on us in the future. So what can replace the lottery? Well, how about a covenant? A covenant that says that we as a nation are in solidarity with each other, that we stand by each other, that we hold each other up, that we don't let whole neighborhoods slip through the cracks. If we understood generational poverty as a national failure, rather than as the sum total of millions of these inexplicable individual failures, then we might be motivated to devote the resources needed to begin to address it in a serious way. We might gather the will to confront those who prey on the vulnerable. We might get honest about the legacy of institutional racism in this country. And those who have won the lottery might be willing to give up some of their winnings for the benefit of those who have lost it. I want to close today with words from our Judeo-Christian heritage, from the prophet Isaiah. Now, the Old Testament prophets had a real knack for calling out injustice in their own societies. That was sort of what they were good for, wandering around, calling out injustice, always with an eye towards restoring the wholeness of the community, to loving and just relations with one another. So this is from Isaiah 58. Is not this the fast that I choose? To loose the bonds of injustice, to undo the thongs of the yoke, to let the oppressed go free, and to break every yoke. Is it not to share your bread with the hungry, and bring the homeless poor into your house, when you see them naked, to cover them, and not to hide yourself from your own kin? Then shall your light break forth like dawn, and your healing shall spring up quickly. If you remove your yoke from among you, the pointing of the finger, the speaking of evil, if you offer your food to the hungry and satisfy the needs of the afflicted, you shall be like a watered garden, like a spring whose waters never fail. Would you please rise and bow your spirit for closing hymn?